On an isthmus of ice at the top of the world, where the blistering winds and the frozen sea swirled, near polar bear playgrounds and puffin retreats, at the corner of northeast and northwesterly streets, sat a village of shacks so beaten with snow that a traveler might think it the crossroads of woe. But inside it was toasty, an industrious space, with workers who sang with a smile on their face as they handcrafted widgets and gimcracks galore for the big man in red who watched from the door. They made cheerbots and hollows and digimijigs and nanotech darters with more zags than zigs, all perfectly packaged to be given, not sold. They made them in bulk, more than 1 million fold. And the work went on happily, day, noon, and night, as the presents were warehoused and stacked to great height, until one frigid evening, quite late in December, they'd ship out 2 children on a night to remember. But this year's blizzards seemed quite out of sync, as the slate-covered skies turned suddenly pink. From the soot of the mills making presents all day, even white polar bears were now lacquered and gray. And the isthmus of ice on which they all stood, well, it seemed to be shrinking, and that was no good, thought a shy, tiny welder who worked second shift, whose prefrontal cortex how-comed and what-ifed.
Why could they not see it?
He thought to himself, as he tracked the fresh cracks in the shiny ice shelf.
I must take this up with the big man in red. He'll know what to do,
the tiny elf said. Now, Tiny, Red smiled as he washed for his meal, I'm not sure all this thawing is that big a deal. And to foul up the air, that's not our intent. Our output is up by 3,000%. You worry too much, my thoughtful young friend. Our planet has always been able to mend.
But I think this is different.
The elf stood his ground.
Our approach to mass gifting seems no longer sound. See those kerosene vats and barges of coal? And those pumps, pumping petrol from under the shoal. They're so dirty and leaky, it's hard to dismiss. We need much cleaner ways to make presents than this. To rely on these fuels is just crudely archaic. We need windmills and hydro and photovoltaic.
Old Red just ho-hoed and gave Tiny a smile. Take a break from the floor and relax for a while. It's not easy to make all these gifts in 1 year. Without enough voltage, how could we spread cheer? Then he turned to his supper. The discussion was done, leaving Tiny to wonder what little he'd won. So the work augured on at a drum-steady pace, with the gifts stacked so high you could see them from space. But so too the leavings and leftovers mounted, too many bulk barrels to ever be counted. They bubbled and oozed a malodorous goo, like some sort of poisonous holiday stew.
Enough!
Hollered Tiny as he hung up a wreath.
This place is so dirty I feel grit in my teeth.
But no one could hear his lone voice in the crowd, for the din of machinery was simply too loud. When the night finally came to deliver the gifts, the snow had all thawed into tar-covered drifts, and the air hung so heavy, a poison miasma, that the reindeer were racked by a back-cracking asthma, and the elves and the flight crew kept coughing and sneezing in an onslaught of mucus with no sign of easing. The conditions, no doubt, struck Red with despair. His beard was near black from the ash in the air. We can't transport parcels in a climate like this. It's a foul final blow to the season of bliss. But Tiny, whose brain had been spinning high speed, stepped forward 3 steps, cleared his throat to proceed.
We're a sharp-witted lot with noggins to spare. Surely we can find answers if only we dare. All the whatnots and know-how we use every day, why, we'll assemble a new brand of earth-friendly sleigh. We'll build turbo toboggans and prep them for flight with the power of sunshine and the great northern light. And they'll skip through the sky on a silent trip, unloading their gifts like the crack of a whip. If we commit to this path with our hearts full of cheer, the ice will return and the skies will all clear. My friends and co-workers, please listen to me. I know we can do this. Just help me and see.
The crowd stared at Tiny as if he were mad. Just how much rum cake and elf punch had he had? And no one dared move out of fear that they'd find that this cheerleading elf was quite out of his mind. The clock was tick-ticking, so Old Red replied, The thought you've put into this can't be denied. But how could we build such a curious thing? There's no time to tweak all the kinks it would bring. It's just not a sensible course to pursue. No, I'm afraid this year there's not much we can do. But Tiny the elf, undeterred from his goal, gathered pencils, a compass, a slide rule, and scroll.
I've got blueprints and drawings already designed, and a half-built sleigh sample. I hope you don't mind. It's fully electric, no ooze or exhaust. It'll circle the globe at 1/10 the cost. I know you think there's not much we can do, but it's all how you see it, from which point of view.
So the crowd gathered round to consider his plan.
Put up perhaps we could do this.
Just maybe we can.
The programmers and hammerers and elf engineers, they gathered their keyboards and mallets and gears, then turned to Old Red for some sign of consent. He paused, then he winked, and they knew what he meant. The factory fired up like a hive full of bees, with each elf unleashing his own expertise to construct this emission-free holiday craft, around which they hovered and no longer laughed. And Tiny stood tall as he counseled his crew to streamline that software and tighten that screw as they scavenged components from leftover stock, one eye always checking the factory clock. It seemed such a daunting, impossible task. Why would anyone do this? A skeptic might ask. But with expert attention to matters at hand, they finished the project much faster than planned. On the nose, they connected an infrared light to slash through pollution that hung in the night, then switched on a digital jingle bell horn, a proximity system intended to warn all the children and parents to dart up to bed if they heard it jingling out overhead. Old Red ventured forward to admire their skill. It's impressive, I know, but say what you will, with a clock on the wall reading 1:45, we need dozens of these just to get the job done. I commend your ambition. You're willing to try, but it's simply too late and too dreary to fly. Still the elves soldiered on, replicating their feat, from the single sky sleigh to an entire fleet. Then they packed them all up with the gifts that they made and prepped them for flight with a joyous parade. Even Red was won over, swept up in the thrill. We'll deliver these presents. You betcha we will. And that's just what they did. They delivered them all. Every widget and cheerbot and whatchamacall. They shared millions of hollows and digimijigs and nanotech darters with more zags than zigs until every last one was delivered with care. And they got it all done with 12 seconds to spare. But the real gift that night was much harder to see. Although Tiny could feel it, I think you'll agree, it's impossible to wrap and still harder to send. 'Twas the gift of a planet now able to mend. And it all had begun with just one tiny voice and the strength to propose an unpopular choice.
So hold dear to your daydreams despite what they say.
Like Tiny the Elf and his marvelous sleigh.